Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains back from the grave. And today, we are going to discuss the tale of the USS West Virginia, a battleship. Oh yeah, we like battleships around here. A member of the Colorado class of battleships, she has an interesting tale and is actually one of my favorite battleships ever, partially because of some universal bias and the fact that I actually grew up in the state of West Virginia. But she does have a really good story that I absolutely want to tell you, but of course, naturally, a lot of people have been like, you should make Azure Lane references every time you talk about ships, and okay, fine, we're all degenerates here, I get it. I could certainly play into that, and I do wonder how the Azure Lane artists interpreted West Virginia.
My feels break through the soul. She makes me beg, she makes me bleed. She'll never let me off my knees.
I think I need to go to church. USS West Virginia, also known as BB-48, was laid down on the 12th of April, 1920, officially launched the 17th of November, 1921, and finally commissioned the 1st of December, 1923. Now, based on those dates, I think it's pretty obvious to most of you historically relevant people that she did not, in fact, participate in World War I. The design of the Colorado class was developed during that war, and they were actually the culmination of the standard type battleship series that was built for the United States Navy. They're actually very, very similar to the earlier Tennessee design, but they have significantly more powerful main batteries of 8 16-inch guns in twin turrets. The Colorados were initially a group of 4 battleships: Colorado, Maryland, West Virginia, and Washington, but Washington was actually never finished. She was 75% done when she was canceled under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. As a result of that treaty, West Virginia and her sisters would be the most powerful battleships in the United States Navy right up until the North Carolina class entered service right before World War II, when everyone kind of threw the treaties completely out the friggin' window because the Axis had already done that. In the interwar period, West Virginia really didn't do a whole heck of a lot, which is a thing you could say about pretty much every battleship during that time. She mostly did training exercises in the 20s and 30s, but she was at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. She was one of the battleships that was moored in Battleship Row when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. She was actually right next to USS Tennessee, and as a result could not maneuver, nor was she in a position to activate her engines quickly enough to get out of there anyway, unlike the Nevada, who we talked about before. West Virginia was stuck as a sitting duck. She was hit 7 times by Type 91 torpedoes, and bombers hit her with a pair of 16-inch armor-piercing shells that had actually been converted into bombs. The first bomb had hit the port side and penetrated her superstructure. This caused extensive damage to her casemates right below deck. Due to the ammunition stored in those casemates, secondary explosions caused serious fires. The second bomb fortunately failed to explode, but it did destroy one of her guns, as well as the OS-2U Kingfisher float plane that was on her catapult on top of that turret. The Kingfisher's destruction actually caused gasoline to spill onto the deck, which also caught fire. One of the torpedoes that struck her had actually hit aft, which disabled her rudder, and at least 3 of them hit below her belt armor. The torpedoes opened large holes in her hull, from frames 43 to 52, as well as from 62 to 97. And at least one of the torpedoes actually passed through the holes that were already open after the ship began to list and exploded on the second armor deck. This probably would have capsized her if not for the damage control efforts that were initiated by Lieutenant Claude V. Ricketts. He and his men were able to keep West Virginia stable enough so as not to capsize, although they couldn't avert her inevitable sinking. West Virginia's captain during the attack was one Mervyn S. Bennion, and during the attack he'd been badly wounded by a shrapnel shard that flew off of USS Tennessee nearby. He may have survived if he had gotten to a first aid station, Cook Third Class Doris Miller and several other sailors attempted to move him to get him first aid for just that purpose, but Bennion refused to leave his post and ordered his men to leave him and save themselves. He used one of his arms to hold his wounds closed, and he wound up dying from blood loss while he was still commanding his crew during the attack. As a result of his actions, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. As for Cook Third Class Doris Miller, well, he's another hero of that day. Not only did he help move his wounded captain, but he manned an anti-aircraft machine gun for which he had absolutely no training and shot down several Japanese planes while doing so. His actions that day made him the first African American to be awarded the Navy Cross. He became a hero and icon of the civil rights movement during those times, and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who personally awarded Miller with his medal, said of the commendation, "This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race, and I'm sure that the future will see others similarly honored for brave acts." Anyway, back to the West Virginia, who's still kind of in the middle of sinking. Due to the damage control efforts, like I said, West Virginia avoided capsizing, though she did slowly sink on an even keel. Her crew would wind up being evacuated at that point, although a group did volunteer to go back and fight the fires that were still raging throughout the ship. Fuel oil that leaked out of the destroyed USS Arizona wound up also catching fire and engulfed West Virginia, because West Virginia just could not catch a break in the fire department that day. The day following the attack, the fires were finally damped down. A total of 106 of West Virginia's men were killed in the attack, and among them, there were 3 sailors in particular: Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Lewis Costin. These men had survived in an airtight storeroom until at least the 23rd of December, 16 days after the attack. But West Virginia wouldn't be refloated until the 17th of May, and as a result, those men were not saved. Many of the remains from West Virginia actually couldn't be identified, and as of the 6th of December 2019, the Department of Defense announced that 8 of the 35 unknown remains from West Virginia had been identified, but that still leaves quite a number, and we aren't sure who they were. When West Virginia was finally refloated, 17th of May 1942, she was moved into Dry Dock Number 1 in Pearl Harbor on the 9th of June for an inspection. The inspection showed all 7 torpedo hits, as at first they only thought she was hit by 5. She of course still wasn't seaworthy, so the workers had to make temporary repairs so she could move back to Bremerton, Washington for a thorough reconstruction. When Pearl Harbor happened, the Navy had to seriously evaluate how they were going to remodel their old battleships and which ones were going to be modernized at all. Proposals were drawn up to replace the lattice masts with other structures that could accommodate the heavier radar equipment that was being fitted onto their ships. West Virginia and California had been badly damaged in Pearl Harbor. Due to this, they were viewed as not being able to be returned to service all that quickly like some of the other battleships would be. However, the silver lining of this is they could have different modifications added to them in addition to the regular repairs they needed to undergo. In their case, they would have torpedo bulges installed that had been planned before the war started. Not only would these help defend from torpedo hits, but they would offset the loss of freeboard that was incurred by an addition of 1,400 long tons of deck armor. West Virginia was also supposed to receive a battery of dual-purpose 5-inch guns, but this work was deferred as it would take too long in addition to all the other work they had planned for her. Also, in West Virginia's case, there was a limited number of dry docks on the West Coast. West Virginia had to wait until both Tennessee and California were rebuilt, and work on her wasn't actually completed until September of 1944. The repairs and modifications saw her radically altered in appearance, not just because of the torpedo bulges, but her superstructure was almost completely revised. The old heavily armored conning tower was removed and a smaller tower was erected instead to reduce interference with the new anti-aircraft guns' fields of fire. The tower was actually taken from Brooklyn-class cruisers that had also recently been rebuilt, and the foremast was replaced with a tower mast that housed the bridge and the main battery director, and her second funnel was also removed, with the boilers being trunked into an enlarged forward funnel. The ship's weapons suite was also overhauled. She was given air search radar, and fire control radars for her main and secondary batteries, and the latter was replaced by a uniform battery of 16 5-inch 38 caliber guns in 8 twin mounts. These batteries were controlled by state-of-the-art Mark 37 directors, and her light anti-aircraft battery was revised, which now consisted of 10 quadruple 40mm Bofors guns and 43 20mm Oerlikons. And by early July of 1944, she was ready to begin her sea trials in her post-refit condition. She finally loaded ammunition on the 2nd of July and departed for her trials off of Port Townsend, Washington. Once that was complete, she finally returned to Hawaii and arrived there on the 23rd of September, 1944, and she joined Battleship Division 4, as well as the aircraft carrier USS Hancock, all of which were sailing towards Manus in the Admiralty Islands to begin preparations for the upcoming operations in the Philippines. This is where West Virginia would really start to shine. She'd been out of the war for, well, most of it, frankly, and since we, in retrospect, know that the war would end just the following year, you wouldn't expect West Virginia to have much time to do any solid work, but boy howdy, she was out for blood. You don't just sink the USS West Virginia and expect not to pay for it, is what I'm trying to say. This ship had had enough. You sank her. You killed a significant portion of her crew, and you made her sit around the entire time waiting to be fixed. Oh, it was on. On the 12th of October, 1944, West Virginia and the rest of the fleet sortied to begin the invasion of the Philippines, starting with the island of Leyte. West Virginia was assigned to Task Group 77.2, which is the shore bombardment force for the operation, and was commanded by Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf. Alongside her was also the USS California. The fleet arrived on the 19th of October, and at 700 hours, West Virginia and the rest of the task force moved into their bombardment positions. They opened fire on targets around Tacloban, shelling Japanese positions, and providing covering fire for the underwater demolition teams that were preparing the invasion beaches for, well, the invasion. West Virginia would fire a total of 278 shells from her main battery and 1,586 rounds from her secondary guns. She actually wound up grounding herself at some point, which damaged 3 of her propellers. The damaged blades caused a really bad vibration that limited her speed to only 16 knots, but she still remained on station either way. She continued providing fire support and anti-aircraft defense as the fleet continued to be attacked by Japanese aircraft, and every single night, she and the rest of the task force withdrew away from the beaches. The landing force on Leyte would actually lead to what is known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese Navy had planned to push back the Allied landing in the Philippines. It was complicated and involved 3 separate fleets. Their northern force was under Vice Admiral Jisuburo Ozawa. The center force was under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, and the southern force was under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. Ozawa's carriers, who were now depleted of most of their aircraft, were only meant to serve as decoys to distract the Allied forces away from Kurita's and Nishimura's battleships, whose job it was to attack the invasion fleet directly. Kurita's ships were detected in the San Bernardino Strait on the 24th of October 1944. This resulted in the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. West Virginia wasn't a part of that. Though during that battle, it's worth mentioning that the Musashi, one of the 2 largest battleships ever constructed, was sunk, and that resulted in Kurita temporarily reversing his course. By this point, the northern force had been detected. Admiral William F. Halsey ordered a fast carrier task force to destroy that force. While those maneuvers were occurring, Nishimura's force approached the Surigo Strait to attack the invasion fleet from the south. His fleet consisted of battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, as well as 4 additional destroyers. He was supplemented by a second striking force that consisted of heavy cruisers Nachi and Ashigara, the light cruiser Abukuma, as well as 4 more destroyers. Nishimura's fleet passed through the strait on the night of the 24th of October. and then they came under attack by American PT boats, followed by destroyers, and this initiated the Battle of Sirigo Strait. One of these destroyers torpedoed Fuso and disabled her, although Nishimura continued towards the objective anyway. It was about this point that West Virginia, who seemed at the head of the American line, was alerted by observers on board USS Tennessee that they spotted the flashes in the distance as a light American craft attacked Nishimura's force. It was the middle of the night, by the way, at only 3:02 in the morning. West Virginia's search radar wound up picking up the enemy force at a range of 42,000 yards, or 38,000 meters. Oldendorf gave the order to open fire at 3:51, and West Virginia did that just a minute later, and she was followed up by Tennessee and California. They concentrated on battleship Yamashiro. The thing was, West Virginia was equipped with a more modern targeting radar than the other battleships were. USS Tennessee and California were having trouble locating a target and eventually held their fire, but West Virginia, and I can't stress this enough, out for blood and with a more modern radar, hit Yamashiro on her bridge on the first salvo. With the range locked in, Yamashiro was quickly hit several times by multiple American vessels, including West Virginia, doing significant damage to her and causing fires to break out. Then they shifted fire to Megami, who was also hit several times and suffered severe damage. This went on until about 400 hours, when both Megami and then Yamashiro turned to retreat, both on fire. Seeing this, Oldendorf ordered his battleships to make a 150-degree turn, and West Virginia complied at 4:02, leading the other battleships on the new course, which ran parallel to Yamashiro's line of retreat. They were going to chase them down, but confusion aboard USS California led her to fall out of position, and by doing this, she masked the rest of the battleships and forced them to cease firing to avoid hitting her. California, get out of the way! We're in the middle of a battle! I don't have time for this! We are out for revenge here! You're distracting! As a result, the Japanese were able to retreat into the darkness, and the report of torpedoes in the water also forced the Americans to turn back. This battle is notable. Not only did West Virginia score a significant amount of hits on the enemy, but this was the last ever battle between battleships. At no point during the rest of the war or since has a battleship and another battleship fired on each other. It just never happened again. During the rest of the war, West Virginia would continue to serve out as basically a bombardment platform, supporting all the island invasions that were going on in the Pacific Theater. She also shot down plenty of Japanese aircraft and took very little damage herself, with the sole exception occurring on the 1st of April, 1945. She was hit by a kamikaze plane, which struck her superstructure just forward of the No. 2 director for the secondary battery. This explosion killed 4 and wounded 7 inside one of the 20mm gun batteries. The aircraft had actually been carrying a bomb too that penetrated below the second deck, although fortunately that bomb did not actually detonate and it was defused by West Virginia's bomb disposal officer. Despite the damage, she once again remained on station and fired star shells to illuminate Marine positions to help them repel Japanese infiltration attacks. Her dead were buried at sea, and then she was actually called out to hunt down a small squadron that had been spotted in the water that was centered around battleship Yamato. Now, as much as I'd love to tell you that USS West Virginia totally tangled with Yamato, if you've been paying attention, you know that battleships would never fight against other battleships ever again. Yamato was sunk well before West Virginia would find her, and she resumed her bombardment operations and air defense for the fleet. She remained on station there until the 20th of April, when she was called to replace her sister, Colorado, as she had suffered an accidental explosion while replenishing ammunition. Her supporting duties would continue until the end of the war, and in fact she was expected to take part in Operation Downfall, which was the invasion of Kyushu, the Japanese mainland. But this would never occur. As most of you are probably aware, in early August, 2 atomic bombs would be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 3 days after that. These attacks displayed such incredible power to the Japanese that they were forced to surrender, thereby avoiding a costly and likely even more destructive invasion of the Japanese home islands. But West Virginia's job wasn't quite finished though. On the 12th of August, before the Japanese would surrender, USS Pennsylvania was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. West Virginia had to send a whaleboat with pumps to assist the damaged ship. And then, on the 15th of August, Japan finally surrendered, and West Virginia's contingent of Marines began preparations for the occupation of Japan. West Virginia was actually present during the formal surrender ceremonies that were conducted on board battleship Missouri on the 2nd of September, and West Virginia actually loaned 5 of her own musicians to play during the ceremony. She remained in Tokyo for 2 weeks after that to assist with the initial occupation effort, and on the 14th of September, she took a group of 270 passengers back to the United States. She returned to where she began in the war on the 4th of October, 1945. Yep, back to Pearl Harbor. There, her crew had decided she had been a very useful battleship, and gave her a celebratory repainting before they departed again on the 9th of October for San Diego, California, which she reached on the 22nd of October. During the war, she had been given 5 battle stars, which is actually extremely impressive given she missed most of the conflict. She took part in Navy Day celebrations on the 27th of October 1945, and then she took part in Operation Magic Carpet, which is the repatriation effort to return American servicemen from the Pacific Theater. She took passengers in Pearl Harbor and carried them back to San Diego. She made 3 runs through the end of the year, and last arriving in San Diego, California on the 17th of December, 1945. She remained there until the 4th of January, 1946, when she left for Bremerton, Washington, arriving there on the 12th of January, 1946, where she was scheduled for deactivation. She was eventually moved to Seattle, Washington, and 4 days later she was tied up alongside Colorado. Work was conducted to prepare her to be a part of the reserve fleet, which continued until February, and she was formally decommissioned on the 9th of January 1947. She survived in the reserve fleet for actually quite a long time, until the 1st of March 1959, when she was finally struck from the Naval Vessel Register, and placed for sale for scrapping. She was sold on the 24th of August to the Union Minerals and Alloys Corporation. She was towed to Todd Pacific Shipyard in Seattle on the 3rd of January 1961 and broken up. Despite the ship being gone, like the vast majority of those battleships are, pieces of her still persist. One of her anti-aircraft guns is on display in City Park in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and her wheel and binnacle are on display at the Hampton Roads Naval Museum. When she was sold for scrap, students at West Virginia University raised funds to preserve her mast, which is still housed on campus to this day, and her bell is on display at West Virginia State Museum in Charleston. In the year 2000, then Governor of West Virginia, Cecil Underwood, issued a proclamation on the 59th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, naming Interstate Highway 470, which is located in West Virginia, the USS West Virginia Memorial Highway, in memory of those sailors that lost their lives while serving on board such a fine ship. So I think it's worth saying, despite being heavily damaged in the beginning of World War II, and of course not being responsible for starting the fight, she sure knew how to finish it! And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sumdu267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose Tribal Typhoon, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Lock Kraken, Twin Fox, Dimeblade 17, and Anzac A1. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.